Well, hello and welcome to our first online event. My name is Kieran. As many of you know, this week is Dying Matters Awareness Week, which is why it seems apt for us to be coming together to talk about our campaign and to view what I think will be a really interesting interview with the award-winning journalist Melanie Reid. I'm also pleased to say that we're joined by the chair of My Death, My Decision, Trevor Moore, and Amanda Ward, who is the chief executive of Friends at the End, for a Q&A session. A few quick bits of housekeeping, although I promise I won't hold you very long. It's unlike other events you've attended, you will only be able to see myself, Trevor and Amanda for the majority of this event. The reason for that is that there's so many of us, it could become unruly quite quickly. But we'd still like to hear your comments and thoughts, so please do use the chat function throughout the majority of the meeting and tell us your opinions. But be mindful that obviously think of others when you use it, because we won't tolerate anything which makes our other users feel uncomfortable. Secondly, many of you pre-submitted questions, which is fantastic, but if a question comes to you in the event, feel free to send it using the Q&A button, which should be at the bottom of your screen. There are two ways we're going to do questions as part of this event. One is that I'm going to read out some of the pre-submitted questions. And secondly, we're going to invite some of you to ask them directly. When I say invite, I mean we're going to unmute you and turn your camera on. You don't have to do anything as part of that, but just be aware that there will be a short beep on your screen and it may say disconnecting while we're setting up all the technical stuff. The final thing to say is that it is often the case that technology can go wrong. So if for whatever reason the video we're going to show doesn't work, you should see in the chat there is a link to YouTube. That link shows the video we're going to show. It's a private link, which means only you here will be able to view the video, but feel free to watch it and then come back to the event for question and answer. So without any more to say, I will hand over to Trevor to introduce the event.
Thank you, Kieran, and welcome everyone to this joint My Death, My Decision and Friends at the End webinar. Many of you will know that 3 weeks ago today, we would all have been happily ensconced at the Friends House on Euston Road for an event which comprised two substantive elements. Today's filmed interview with Melanie Reid and also a live streaming by Dr. Stephanie Green, who is president of CAMAT, which is the Canadian Association for Assisted Death Practitioners. That's on the 30th of May and will be live streamed. And you should have had details of that in the initial email that came round. So I do hope you'll sign up for that. Promises to be a very interesting occasion. Today's film was recorded with Melanie up in Scotland in January. It's not practical for her to be here live today. We do have questions and answers which Amanda and I, and indeed Kieran, I'm sure, will be happy to aim to address. And depending on how many questions there are, we will ask Melanie if she'd be willing to give some written responses to questions which we could then circulate. As Kieran has said, this is Dying Matters Awareness Week. If you're not aware of Dying Matters, I would encourage you to go to their website. They've got some excellent materials about how to begin difficult end-of-life decisions. And indeed, we this week have been, and I know FATE have as well, been trying to encourage people to at least think about making some of those important legal documents, putting them in place, like an advance decision and also a lasting power of attorney for health and welfare. Because in fact, the time to do that is probably when you're not ill, but you would like to know that your affairs are in order. There are plenty of resources, many of which were listed at the end of the email that came round advising of the two initial events. Now, of course, this isn't the time for us to be trying to engage with decision makers like MPs because they're distracted for other obvious reasons. But I can assure you in the background, certainly we, and I know FATE are still pondering their campaign strategy and working on things while we've got this sort of fallow period so that we are ready to continue our work when things change. I should just say we so appreciate your support our organisation at all times. I think everyone who's participating today is more or less one of our members or supporters. And just to let you know that we do appreciate that. We're a bunch of mostly volunteers, and we know that in the background we've got people like you who are compassionate and caring, like we hope we are too. And so thank you very much. I'm just going to ask Amanda, before the video is shown, of whether she has any comments she'd like to add. Amanda?
No, I think that we can just head over to the video now. Melanie Reid is a patron of Friends at the End. So Melanie has done bits and pieces for us before in the past. She's gave talks to our parliamentarians here at Scottish Parliament, and done bits of journalistic pieces for us as well. So we hugely appreciate her support. And as Trevor said, it's unfortunate that she can't be here, but if there's any questions, then we could feed them back to her.
Hello, Melanie. Many people will be familiar with your story, either from your spinal column in the Times, or more recently from reading your book, The World I Fell Out Of. But perhaps you'd like to explain the life-changing event that happened to you in 2010. In your book, you say, "I nosedived from the upper world into the lower one."
Okay, well, I was 52. I was fitter than I'd ever been. My son had gone to university. I was sort of free and happy, mistress of my universe, and I was partaking in at the bottom end of a dangerous sport. I'd done all the things that done all the safety stuff, but I know my horse refused a jump, a little cross-country jump, and I nosedived and landed. I did a face plant, and my body flipped over my back, and I broke my own neck, broke my back too. So I was, it was like a nuclear explosion, because I was paralyzed from C6-7 vertebrae in my neck, which meant that my from the sort of chest, upper chest down, I'm paralyzed, and my hands are very damaged, and I had to learn to live again. I had lost my life. And I'd lost my body. My family were also destroyed in this explosion. And I had entered a parallel world, which I don't think you ever really realize exists down there until it happens, until you join the people in the parallel world.
Yes.
And there I was, down amongst the frail, the elderly, the vulnerable, the disabled, looking up at the happy, shiny people in the world that I used to belong to.
In your book, you refer to yourself as having been the Times' unofficial pro-euthanasia correspondent. I think that was in a letter or an exchange you had with someone. How has your disability affected your position on assisted dying?
I was always in favour of self-determination, and I had seen my own mother who got vascular dementia. I had seen her desperate to end her life, and in fact that's what she did. She took her own life when she was in the care home, and I knew the courage and the bravery that had taken. I had heard her pray. She used to plead to me, I don't want to go on like this. And so I knew exactly what it meant to be kept beyond your life, your lifespan that you were enjoying. And so when this happened to me, there was this kind of, I had this enormous residual knowledge of what it meant to be trapped in a body that you didn't want to be in any longer. And I was also I had grown up in the 60s and 70s, early 80s, when a woman's rights were total, and I was a feminist, and I don't use that word in the sense that a divisive sense. I think all women now are feminists. All women now believe they have a right to control their own bodies. But I had grown up fighting for the right for contraception, fighting for the right not to be fondled by men or bullied by men, and told what to do by men, told, that I had to stay at home or look after children. And I had always been a bit of a rebel, and that was in my genes, obviously genetic from my mother too. So I wasn't in any way going to have my right over this body that I live in taken away from me. And when it was blown away in my fall, when I lost the right, I lost the ability to be able to control and move my body, I became doubly incontinent, I became dependent. I need to be washed and dressed in the morning. And when that happened to me, I knew instantly that my right to decide what happened to me was mine, and no one could take it away. It was a total and absolute conviction on my part. I would never ever seek to impose my views on anyone else. This is about my rights, and I total respect for people with similar injuries to me, or who are disabled in some way, who are ill, but they choose not to go down the euthanasia road, or even to have it as an option. And I respect them in the same way that I respect people of faith who make the decision on a faith-based way, but I would ask them only to give me the same respect in return, to make my decisions, not to interfere in my life. I think euthanasia is also about love. It's recognizing that if you really, really love someone, you would want them to be free, and they would want you to know that they loved you when they went out the door. Loving someone is freeing them up to do what they want to do, and the hardest thing is leaving love. But people know when it's right, and people who love you know when it's right. They want you to be free of pain and suffering and the discomfort, the appalling discomfort that comes from having a body that's not healthy. That sense of being locked into a body that is a prison. We all want to set people free from prison. We can rehabilitate them, set them free. So give people the right to make that choice.
That's interesting, because you've touched on this in your book about how really everyone's disability is relative, and individuals might have their own particular thresholds as to what the impact may be on them individually. It's not something that you can say will have a uniform impact on the way they see their life. And I just wondered what you say to disability lobbying groups who purport to speak for the wider community about the so-called slippery slope and so on.
We all possess our own disability. There is all the nuances under the sun. There are no two disabilities are the same. No two people react the same way to their disability, to the kind of prison they feel themselves to be in. Some people don't feel in prison at all, and that's wonderful. But only we know what it's like. Only we know what it's like to inhabit our bodies and how we react to it. And I personally do not want to be put in a tribe by anybody else. No one has the right to label me, put me in a pigeonhole, put me in a box and say, oh, she has a spinal injury, but she's okay. She can get around in a wheelchair. She has people to love her. She can carry on. Nobody has the right to tell me at what point my life is livable, endurable, enjoyable. That belongs to me. Just as it's my right to say, I choose to go out to the shops today. I chose to have a baby when I was 32 or whatever it was. I choose to eat chips tonight. I choose to have a love affair with this person. These belong to me as a human being, as an individual human being. They do not belong to anybody else who does not sit in the chair that I sit in, wear the shoes I wear that do not work, that have no sole on. The tread on my soles is completely untouched. So I don't walk anywhere in them, but I wear them. And until other people know what it's like to wear those shoes that never walk anywhere, they have no right to pass judgment on how I live my life.
There's another aspect to this. Our patron, Paul Lamb, is in the process of bringing a legal case against the government to allow assisted dying, really following on from Tony Nicklinson a few years ago. And he's adamant that that law should help the incurably suffering as well as the terminally ill. But he's clear that he doesn't want to die now. For him, it's about bringing him certainty for the future. And I just wondered if you empathise with that and can understand where he's coming from in saying that.
I totally understand that some people are having a good life despite their difficulties, as I am. And they would like to continue doing that. I really love my life. Well, I don't love it. I have grave difficulties with a lot of it, but I love the fact that I'm here to be with my husband, to see my son growing up, to see the friends I love. All I want to know is that when I don't want to carry on, that I have the right to choose, and that like him, I just want to know that when things get too bad, I have that choice. And in fact, knowing that I have that choice makes my life easier. I can be happier because I know that if I start suffering really, really badly, I can say, okay, I don't want to go on with this anymore. Funnily enough, when I came out of hospital and I first came home, and there were enormous challenges in getting to grips with living in the house where I had been able-bodied. What I did, I built up a little stash. I called it my suicide stash, and it was a stash of benzodiazepines, which I knew, I had so many of them that I knew that if I chose to, they I could have a nice quiet end. And the fact that I knew they were there, sitting in my little old pillbox, or my big pillbox now, it was my insurance policy, it was my security blanket. And gosh, I was glad I had that, because that is what enabled me to say, right, what are we going to do today? We're going to have a good life, we're going to make the best of it. You can't make the best of it until you have the right to know what the worst of it is, and you can open the door and leave. That's my belief.
It's interesting you say that, because in those jurisdictions that do have laws permitting assisted dying, often those who ask for help don't avail themselves of it, but they find precisely that it brings an element of control back into their own lives, knowing that they can make the decision when they choose, not being told by someone else.
I have very little control in my life, in the sense that I'm fairly powerless. When you end up paralysed in a wheelchair, you lose a lot of your power, authority, your agency. That power that I have, that bit of control, that knowledge that my fate will not be decided by anyone else, that I can choose the time of a good death, surely that is the one bit of agency that I'm entitled to. Not that I don't want it for anyone else. Nobody wants it for anybody else. We just seek it as individuals, as a democratic right for us, as one human being.
Indeed, I think in California, their legislation is called the End of Life Option Act, which I think is an accurate description.
I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
Maybe we could sort of start putting pressure on our
Yeah.
MP for that.
Yes, yeah. Well, indeed, when our Parliament last considered legislation in 2015, one of the most common reasons for opposing a change was the protection of vulnerable people, such as those who might decide to ask for help if they feel they're a burden to their families or their other loved ones. I just wonder what your response might be to the MPs who voted on that basis.
I understand why MPs feel they have to protect people. That there is this concept of the frail, vulnerable person who does not, they feel could be swayed by a bullying, greedy family in order to pop off and leave their inheritance for them. It is absolutely right that society should react in that way and say, no, we have to protect people who are not as strong and as articulate and in control of their destiny as you and I might feel. But we live in a society with incredibly clever lawyers and doctors. We have the philosophers, we have the absolute residual knowledge in this country to draft humane protocols that would make sure that nobody was at risk of being hustled off the life. We have power of attorney. I mean, the effort you have to go to get power of attorney, it is, as we can put in place strong legal and social requirements that will act as an insurance policy.
You touched on this earlier, that about your early life, and I think you were touching on contraception in the 60s and that sort of thing. And I think Polly Toynbee has said that she likens an assisted dying law to that for abortion rights back in the 60s in terms of effecting major social change. Maybe this is the last one, and I just wondered if you had a perspective on that.
I think absolutely. We decide what we do as young women. We decide how we live our lives. When we get to the end of our life, why should we not retain the ability to make that final decision? It's totally illogical, apart from anything else. It defies the civilized society that we live in. The continuity of choice and decision making that anybody has who lives in a free society. There is a suggestion that we should have built into any legislation a 6-month limit, so that when you knew that you had only 6 months left, you could make the decision. You would be allowed to have an assisted suicide. My problem with this is that it is totally arbitrary, because nobody can tell you for sure when those 6 months are up, when those limits come. it's one man or one woman, one doctor's decision or opinion. But nobody knows. They don't know. You hear of people who live far, far longer than is expected. You hear of people who go much more swiftly. And I would make the analogy of young women. If you're having a baby and you're told at the beginning that there is always the option you can have an epidural if things get too tough. You can have the baby however you want to have it. You can have it pain-free, gas-free, without any medical intervention at all. But if things get a bit tough, then that option is always there for you whenever you want it. We hope you don't need it. We hope you'll come through at the other side with a healthy baby, but it's there if you need it. And I think we should approach this legislation in the same way and encourage people to think, hey, if my personal circumstances are such that I didn't expect to go down this way, but I really need help right now, and I want it, and this is the right decision for me, give me pain relief, give me an escape route, it's there.
I'll just wait a moment in case anyone was watching it on the YouTube link and returning back. But while we do, I'm sure many of us already know about My Death, My Decision and Friends at the End. But for those who perhaps don't, I wonder if you could explain a bit about the organisations you lead and why you both got involved. Shall I start with Trevor?
Sure, yes. Well, I've been a humanist celebrant for almost about a decade, and I'm often get to meet people who are terminally ill who want to talk to someone about their own end-of-life choices. And it's always concerned me to see people who are really suffering intolerably and faced with making a decision. And like Melanie was just saying about the Oregon model limited to a 6-month terminally ill right for assisted dying, to me that's just not appropriate. And MDMD's campaign is all about wanting a change in the law for the terminally ill without any arbitrary time limit, but also for those who are suffering intolerably and incurably. Indeed, I think when Tony Nicholson went to court, one of the lords said that, in a sense, Tony was suffering perhaps more than someone who did have a finite prognosis, because his life could go on for decades. He wasn't technically terminally ill, but he was certainly, anyone who saw film of him would have seen that he was suffering intolerably. So there have been all sorts of catalysts that made me want to campaign, and there are other organisations that have more limited aims, but MDMD is very much following, well, the one we're looking to is really the Canada model, where their legislation was introduced in 2016, which initially had a rather tricky criterion to be met about reasonably foreseeable death, which people felt was pretty much the same as being terminally ill. But there's been all sorts of legal activity. Stephanie Green will be touching on all of this in her talk on the 30th of May. But we're very much in the camp of if we have a change in the law, it should apply not only to the terminally ill, but also those who are suffering intolerably and their condition is incurable.
Thanks for that, Trevor. So I got involved with Friends at the End initially from an academic perspective. I was a master's student at the University of Glasgow, studying for my LLM in medical law and ethics, and Friends at the End, particularly Libby Wilson, who was our founding patron, was looking for a researcher to help in the office. So I started working with Friends at the End in April 2012. And I then started working through Friends at the End with Margot MacDonald, MSP, as a researcher on her bill, which was the Assisted Suicide Scotland bill. Margot then died, and I moved to Patrick Harvey's office and became the legal advisor on that legislation. And I continued to work with Friends at the End. So just recently in 2018, we became a registered charity here in Scotland, and we now employ 2 staff members, myself and a part-time administrator. A lot of the work that we do focuses on the Scottish Parliament. We are a UK membership organisation, and our membership is split 50-50 between Scotland and the rest of the UK, but we feel that in Scotland things are a bit more sort of left-leaning, and that the opportunities here in Scotland are far more than in Westminster. So in the last couple of years since we stopped working, since the bill fell in 2015, we have been working with MSPs there. We have an MSP on our board, we have a steering group, and we sponsor the cross-party group on end-of-life choices in the Parliament. So we're still firmly working with parliamentarians here, and we do have a timeline as to when we'll introduce the next piece of legislation there. So a lot of our work does focus on legal policy work, but there's a huge aspect as well which is focusing on our members and supporting our members. And for a long time we have been helping people with getting their end-of-life affairs in order. On our website you can find much more information on advanced care planning around advanced directives and powers of attorney, etc. And that's a free service which we provide, particularly for those who are in need, who maybe can't afford to even register things like powers of attorney or don't know where to start. So there's a lot of work that we do at grassroots level as well, in supporting people on a sort of holistic level as well.
One of the main questions that was pre-submitted by a fair few people was around Melanie's view on disability and how that affected her stance on assisted dying. And Gil asked, how does your position on right to die issues intersect with any views someone might have on disability rights politics? And I wonder, Amanda, if you want to start with that.
Yes, I think the crux of that, what you're getting at there is, what are the commonalities between advocates for assisted dying and people who advocate for disability rights issues. And I think, first of all, it's really important to understand that there are people living with disabilities who will have concerns around assisted dying, and we absolutely need to recognise that. And it's important that we bring these people into the conversation and have them at the table and let us know what their concerns and worries are, so that we can then address them. And also, first of all, that for those who do want to live, we have to do much more around, first of all, assisting people to live. And that's where the commonalities come in terms of more work around social care systems, increasing NHS funding wheelchairs and other assistive technologies, and really rooting out disableism in society. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done there, and that's where we have commonalities, in that we want, everyone that wants to live to have the best life that they can. But for some people, they want the choice of an assisted death, and that's what we advocate for. And I think it's important to understand and to drive home that disability isn't a prerequisite of legislation. So for instance, when I was working on the Assisted Suicide Scotland bill, we actually drafted it in such a way that people who solely had disabilities were actually not eligible by virtue of their disability. These people need to have a terminal illness or a life-limiting illness to qualify under the legislation. So I think it's important that we recognise that, first of all. And again, just referring back to what Melanie said, we approach this from not different subsets of society or different groups of people, but from a real human perspective. And I know that MDMD do that as well. So yeah, does that answer your question?
I would hope Gil feels answered. Trevor, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I just pick up on what Melanie said, and I know Paul Lamb, actually, who's our patron, Paul being the man who is paralysed more or less from the neck down following a car accident in the 90s. He says that he approaches this, first of all, as a human being who has free choice, and he considers that his opinion should be measured by what he believes in that capacity, not by the reason that he has the condition that he does. As Melanie said, you know, two people with the same condition might make different decisions, but they are autonomous and they should be able to make their own decisions.
Fantastic. Well, our next question is from Claire, and I think she should be able to join us. Fantastic. Claire, your microphone and camera is off at the moment.
Okay.
Hi, Claire.
Hello. Hi. Hi. I wanted to ask about the number of people who have to leave Britain to go abroad for an assisted death. Do we know the numbers there?
So I think there's almost 500 people who have travelled from the UK as a whole, including Scotland, to Dignitas or Life Circle. That's the registered number. I think that there's a lot more people who go under the radar.
Gosh.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, that according to our research, only around half of people who travel to Switzerland, only about half of them are known to the police, and there are all sorts of reasons for that. That includes the fact that some people are very reluctant to talk to their doctors because we have first-hand witness, as it were, to the fact that their doctors tried to deter them from going. And we have this awful situation where those who accompany the person going to Switzerland can be prosecuted on their return. And just thought for everybody in this current situation that there are those who have been authorized to go to Switzerland who, because of coronavirus, are unable to travel. If you can imagine the emotional energy that's gone into that, to then be unable to go at the time of your choosing. But that was something I became aware of this week, and I found that quite a profound thing to think about.
And I think our next questioner should be Phil, who also should be able to join us.
Hi. Yeah, so I was interested in when Melanie was talking about when she had her accident. I wondered whether she considered ending her life at the time or very soon after her accident, because what it occurs to me is that if that was a possibility, somebody who had just suffered a major life-changing event like she did might make a hasty decision, whereas actually some months down the road, when she got used to her changed condition, now she's obviously leading a life that, to the extent that it can be, is fulfilling for her. And although she was talking about having a stash of tablets, I'm not quite sure how she would have taken those with her disability. But she has the means, but she's choosing not to use it. So I wonder what sort of safeguards we might want to put in place to make sure that people don't make hasty decisions following a life-changing either accident or suddenly discovering that they do have a terminal illness like a cancer or something.
Would you like to kick off with that, Amanda?
Yeah, sure. So just to, Melanie wrote a book called The World I Fell Out Of, which was published last year or 2018, I think. And if anybody wants a copy of that, I've got one here in the office, which I can send to you if you'd like to read it. And she does mention in the book that she had considered I think, travelling to Dignitas as well. And obviously, thankfully, hasn't done that. Again, I refer back to the fact that in legislation there are safeguards built in terms of time lags between, you know, pre-registration and then the first request, the second request, having multiple doctors, having referrals to psychiatric services if that is flagged up as being necessary, and again making sure that all other alternatives have been explored, so making sure that people have the social care and the other resources that they need to live a full life. In Scotland, and I'm pretty sure across the UK, Melanie wouldn't have satisfied the criteria in our legislation because she didn't have a terminal illness or an incurable illness. So yeah, I think that maybe answers the question. Have you got anything to add, Trevor?
Well, first of all, I would highly recommend everybody reading The World I Fell Out Of, because it's truly inspirational. I think what comes out of it is that obviously this was existential for Melanie, but she turned her thoughts about end of life into real positive energy, and she changed her condition. The prognosis was that she would remain the worst possible in the worst possible condition following her accident, and she just trained and trained and trained and got to the point where she could have some wheelchair mobility as currently. But there is a longer version of the interview, which Kieran, we may post at some, soon, I guess, where I asked her about the case of Daniel James. I don't know if people remember, he was a very young, I think 23-year-old rugby player, paralysed from the neck down, and he went to Switzerland, and I asked her views on that. And although that was a very challenging case, particularly for the parents of such a young man, Melanie's response to that was, in the end, that was his decision. There were the time lags of the type that Amanda's referring to, and she respected his decision to make that, the decision he made, and maybe someone else in those shoes wouldn't have made the same decision.
Well, it's interesting you say this, as a lot of the questions that were pre-submitted looked at or asked about vulnerability and disability. And one that Mark asked was that he said that there seemed to be a real change in attitudes and a shift for organisations that advocate on behalf of people living with disabilities in the last 5 years, particularly the Motor Neurone Disease Association, Alzheimer's UK and Parkinson's UK, all adopting a neutral position on assisted dying reform or taking no stance. And so he wondered what you think might have happened in the last 5 years that have made these shift of attitudes occur. Perhaps if you want to start with that, Trevor.
Well, I think there have been lots of societal changes. All of the research shows that increasingly people, the general public, supports a law on assisted dying in England and Wales. I'm not sure, to be honest, whether the polls have extended to Scotland, which obviously has its own jurisdiction. But clearly there is public will for it to happen, but there isn't political will. And I think a lot of these organisations that have decided to be neutral on the subject means that they can put in their own, at the relevant time, they can put in their own balanced responses to any proposal. The moment an organisation is opposed to assisted dying, then it rules them out from being part of the debate. So I suspect that, I have to be honest, I've not had conversations with the decision makers in those organisations, but that would be my guess.
I think there's a few things that have happened. So I think that in the last 5 years, we have seen, in the last more than 5 years, but there's been a domino effect internationally. So I think that these organisations are seeing it legalised increasingly. And also we have so much empirical research now, which shows that it can be a safe, compassionate, sensible way to help people have a peaceful end of their life. So I think there's the research there now to prove that it's safe, that we maybe didn't have 5 or 10 years ago. I think that is part lobbying by groups like ourselves and Dignity in Dying and others as well, for them to engage with their membership. So quite a few of them recently have polled their membership, and they're now realising that, you know, as is so often the case, the people who purport to represent organisations don't speak on behalf of everyone there. And also, I think in the last 5 years, given that you've used that timescale, I think that there's been a great expansion in the use of things like social media. So people are now, and organisations are now, seeing the real lived experiences in a way that they maybe didn't see before when we were doing, you know, letter writing and these types of things. They're seeing the real suffering that is happening firsthand, and that's hard to turn away from or to sweep under the carpet.
And our next question, I think, comes from Bhavia, who should be able to join us.
Hi, is this better?
Yeah, we can hear.
Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, what do you think are the main challenges for future legislation, and how do you think we might be able to overcome them?
And maybe you start, Trevor.
Yeah. Yes, I think the situation is going to be different in Scotland, and Amanda can speak to that. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, there doesn't seem to be the political will in England and Wales at the moment. And the Justice Secretary has really been most unclear about whether he would support a call for evidence. So we think that the most important thing, and this is where we're focusing our campaign, is on achieving a call for evidence, a public inquiry, because it's only through that that we can, I say not just us, but claims made by opponents can actually be scrutinized and subjected to scientific validation or otherwise, because at the moment it seems to me, I mean, people might claim that MDMD do the same, although obviously we would say we don't, but that people come out with statements which have no foundation, and the only way we can expose that is by a proper independent inquiry, because it's no good us at MDMD saying that's not true. I mean, there was an exchange of correspondence in the Sunday Times between me responding to a letter from the chief executive of Care Not Killing, one of the major opposing groups, who stated that boldly that the majority of people who choose, say, an assisted death in Oregon state that being a burden is their reason. That's their majority reason. But actually, when you look at the data, by far and away the most cogent reasons people give are loss of autonomy. At least 90% of people say that, and over 90% also say inability to enjoy things in life that they have previously enjoyed, and also loss of dignity is close. Being a burden is barely 50%. And if you think about it, when you've thought about the first three items I've just mentioned, which have a far higher rating, you might also be triggered to think, oh yes, being a burden as well, but they're not the primary driving reason. So that's a long way of saying that there are things that are out there which I think influence decision makers who we need to help understand aren't well-founded.
So in terms of challenges, I think one of the difficulties is going to be speaking to people about assisted dying off the back of coronavirus, off the back of a pandemic which has killed already upwards of 30,000 people. That's going to be really, really tricky, but I think that it's really important that there's difficulties, challenges, and there's opportunities there as well, because I think that people are now faced with their own mortality in a way that they haven't been before. And as horrendous as coronavirus is, the people who were there before are still there. There are still people who are suffering incredibly from terminal illnesses, and almost every day at Friends at the End we have an email or a phone call from people. So those people are still there, and they still need help, and they still need us to advocate on their behalf. But the way in which we have those conversations do need to be, you know, there's going to be particular sensitivities given coronavirus. I think as well, in terms of the medical profession, there's a lot of work still to be done there I don't think we'll ever get them fully on board, but to get them to engage with the arguments and to find the commonalities in this. So that's the approach that we've taken at Friends at the End, is what are the commonalities that we have, and meeting there in the middle, and then working out and saying what would you need to see on the face of a bill to maybe not support this, but at least to be neutral on the subject. So again, having that engagement is really important. Trevor's mentioned there is a strong opposition to assisted dying. They are well organised and they are well funded. So it's really important that we bolster support for assisted dying within our charities and in our organisations, so that we can match that when we do come to have the next piece of legislation on the table. So those are just some of the challenges.
It's interesting you say that, because one of the questions that was pre-submitted, and perhaps inevitably given the scenario we're all living in at the moment, is how you think coronavirus will affect attitudes and may affect change in the law. So I wonder, Trevor, if you have any sort of views on that.
Well, I think Amanda's absolutely right that how one addresses that is a very sensitive issue, and coronavirus has inevitably, I think, deferred debate around having an assisted dying law. But what it has done, as Amanda says, it's made people think about their own mortality. I mean, not just people who've had the virus, but I'm sure we all have thought, well, what am I going to do if I get the virus and I get it so badly that I might need a ventilator? What do I actually want that? Because there are then stories about, well, actually ventilation of itself can then worsen someone's position afterwards. So we'll have to make these difficult decisions. I think at the right moment, and it's obviously going to be some months away at least, I think in the light of what's happened now, people will engage more and realise the importance of these end-of-life decisions, and I suspect that, you know, would be on board. We know public opinion is already at around 90%. That maybe the public pressure will then be exerted more on the decision makers.
I think one other challenge that we have here in Scotland, again, I try and look at the challenges and opportunities, is that come May next year we'll have a new parliament. So we have a really good relationship with a number of MSPs at the moment, and we're hoping that the majority of them will get their seat back, but we're going to have a whole new host of MSPs to work with again. So that's one of the challenges for us here in Scotland.
That's nothing. Well, thank you for so many of you for attending this event. I'm going to draw it to a close now, as we're nearing the hour that we said it would go on for. The one thing to remind you all about is that we have a second online event, which is happening at the same time, the 30th of May. That's in 2 Saturdays' time, when Dr. Stephanie Green, who is the president of CAMPA, which is Canada's Professional Assisted Dying Practitioners Association, will be delivering what was going to be the Duran Lecture on dying for reform and living with the outcome. Any questions about that can be found on the same link you would have used to sign up to this event, or on the website www.mydeathmydecision.org.uk. I will just say, is there anything finally that the two panelists would like to add?
Well, I'd certainly echo your thanks to everyone for attending, and as I said earlier, we do appreciate your support. Just a reminder that the event on the 30th will, technology permitting, will be a live stream from Canada, and Stephanie herself will be answering your questions, and she's now aiming to talk for around 30 minutes and then welcome your questions.
Fantastic.
And I'd just add, thanks everyone for coming along today, and if you're not yet a member of Friends at the End, please consider joining our organisation, and I look forward to seeing everyone at the next event.
That's great. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thanks. Cheers.